All right, good morning. Um, After that devotion I did last week, I figured a little bit of a follow up and some study on the wisdom literature would be a good thing to do for us. Some of you had some thoughts and some epiphany moments, or just some questions or things that followed that devotion, and so I started packaging a little bit of a sort of a mini video series to cover some of this material in the wisdom literature. And we're going to start with the book of Proverbs. So what you're looking at here is the software for Accordance. It's a Bible study, biblical studies material software. It comes with some dictionary material here that you see in the center column. And so I'm going to try and walk you through some of this with this software on the screen, just to show you some of the things, and we can be looking at the texts then together. So we're going to start with Proverbs, which means we're going to start with Genesis. Hopefully it'll make sense by the time we're done. So here we go. We're starting in Genesis chapter 3. At this point, humanity is living at peace with God, and they've been created to rule in partnership with God. They are the image of God. All is well and all is as it should be. So we pick up here with the serpent's dialogue with the woman. So he says to the woman, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? She says back, right, we may eat of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the tree in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. So we know this dialogue. It goes on. The end of the dialogue, right? The challenge, you will not die. God knows when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like him, knowing good and evil in our translations. Really, this is the word ra, bad. It has a moral connotation for evil as well in Hebrew, but it's the same word. So good and bad, good and evil. That's what we're looking at here. And so this is sort of the turning point. When the woman saw that the tree was good, it's good. God made it, it's good. It's good for food, and that it was a delight to the eye, and was to be desired to make one wise. Then she takes its fruit and eats it, and gives to her husband, and he eats it, and now we have the problem. I don't want to labor this because there's actually just two really key points out of Genesis chapter 3. The first really key point here is the desire to be wise and trying to get access to that wisdom outside of God's plan, intention, rule, if you will. And I'm using that word rather strategically because as we come down here in Genesis, we run into this one. Verse 16. Now this is to the woman. So he's issued the curse on the serpent, and now he's talking consequences with Adam and Eve. That's kind of how this is typically understood. And so the consequence to Eve, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing, and in pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband. Some of our translations say your desire will be for your husband. And the Hebrew is ambiguous. It can mean the continued desire of partnership, like for her husband, as it was in Genesis 1 and 2. Something in Eve continues to long after that original intention. It can also mean that her desire is contrary to her husband. It's in conflict with him for some reason. And then there's this. But he shall rule over you. So result, this is the consequence of sin. They were supposed to be one flesh, united in good partnership, and now he shall rule over you. And so we look at the Hebrew word here, which is right here in the middle of our screen, this Hebrew Strong's Dictionary. And so mashal, to rule, to have dominion, to govern, to reign, to have ruling, to have power. But then, it's also the same word for a rule, a proverb, to speak in Proverbs. So there's some language ambiguity here to liken, to use figurative language. But it also means to have dominion and to rule and have authority over, which gets us into the text of Proverbs. So now we're going to jump to Proverbs chapter 1. The Proverbs, the rules, the mashal of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a rule, a proverb, a mashal, and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. And then the standalone verse out of this stanza before we jump into the hear my sons and the instruction that goes with it in verse 8 is, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. And there's a parallel verse in Proverbs 9:10. In Proverbs 9:10, the parallel verse is, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. And here's kind of the way Proverbs begins. Proverbs begins with a series of, as we have it numbered, 9 poems where wisdom is personified. Sometimes Lady Folly is personified as well, but really the focus is on Lady Wisdom. The word for wisdom in Hebrew, because Hebrew has masculine and feminine, like every other language on the planet except for English, because English is weird. The word for wisdom is feminine. And so when we personify wisdom as a character, it comes out as lady. So Lady Wisdom is what we're going to get introduced to in these first 9 chapters of the text of Proverbs. Okay? And the father in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8, which seems to be Solomon, right? These are Solomon's sayings to his son. So Solomon's saying to his son, listen to your father's instruction, don't forsake your mother's teaching, and it's all advice on pursuing after, seeking after, and finding wisdom. And so the desire of the son, as hoped for by the parent, is that they will be wise. The son will grow and be wise. He will have prudence, knowledge, discretion, understanding, and guidance. Okay, so where does that land us? Lands us in a really kind of interesting interplay here. Genesis chapter 3, humanity seeks after wisdom from the tree, not from God. God told them, don't do this. This is bad. Going back to that Ra, good and evil, good and bad. This is bad. Don't eat from this tree. They ate from that tree, seeking wisdom, seeking to know good and bad apart from God and God's definitions. So then God says, there's consequences. There's punishment. There's trouble now because of what you have done. Proverbs seeks to give wisdom and instruction with its rules, its sayings, its truisms, its observations of life with the fear of the Lord and knowledge of the Holy One, 1:7 and 9:10, as a central thing to the instructions of the book. So then, a couple of observations as we start to dive into this. Number 1, Proverbs is addressed to the son. And as Proverbs progresses from chapter 1 to chapter 31, it seems that our son is growing up. And that at the end, the Proverbs 31 woman is the ideal wife for the son who's grown up in the father's home. And so there's this embedded sort of narrative arc that covers the text of Proverbs. It's the growing up. It's the getting older. It's the learning and understanding. It's the being educated, but not just in 2 + 2 is 4. It's learning how to navigate life practically with wisdom and discernment. But for Proverbs, it's not wisdom from the tree, it's wisdom with God at its center. The catch to Proverbs, and we overlook this sometimes, train a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Sayings like that, and a lot of the ones that are here in the text of Proverbs, they're not promises. They're observations. They're As Mr. Lewis said to me, they're truisms. They're rules. And like English, all of those rules have an exception. It's not a one-to-one. If I'm righteous, then nothing bad will happen to me. Now, it's better to be righteous than not righteous. And Proverbs takes that up pretty clearly, right? That'll be one of the things we get into in this idea of being righteous when we talk about the text of Ecclesiastes, because it challenges this idea in Proverbs a little bit. But Proverbs' idea is, listen, be righteous and God will take care of you. God will do good things for you. And that's true, but that doesn't mean that life is as easy as sometimes Proverbs makes it to sound. Number one. Number two, the New Testament reminds us pretty clearly our righteousness is as filthy rags. So, take with a grain of salt and an eye on learning the story and the phrases that we get in Proverbs. These little one-line wisdom sayings. These one-line wisdom rules for how life should work. Because they are observations, not necessarily promises. Proverbs 1:7 and 9:10 guide the book. It's the fear of the Lord. Right? It's the fear of the Lord that is the beginning. Nope, it's not what I was looking for. Sorry. Okay, so back to the text of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the... There we go. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, or the beginning of knowledge here in verse 1. The Bible Project folks working on their series for Proverbs pointed this out, and it's a really good point. A lot of our Old Testament advocates that we fear the Lord before we have to be afraid of the Lord. And this is part of what we could learn from Genesis chapter 3 and Proverbs read sort of in tandem with each other. Adam and Eve would have done better to have fear of the Lord. This moral reverence and dread. The literal word here is fear, abject terror. And yes, we have fear of the Lord and reverence, and we have fear of the Lord and great respect and awe and wonder for who he is and all that. Yes, we understand that. But there is a point here that there is there's a really good piece of advice in having the fear of the Lord before we need to be afraid of the Lord. And this is what Adam and Eve run into in the garden. They have fear. They go and hide themselves after what they have done. It would be really good if they would have had a little bit of that before they had eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so this guides all of the wisdom and the sayings and the if-thens that we get in Proverbs. Proverbs taken to its extremes, however, can become what I call vending machine theology, where we put in our $1.25 of whatever it is that God is asking of us, or whatever is right and good and true, and God then is beholden to us to give us our Diet Coke. Proverbs can be taken a bit like that. If we understand what's in Proverbs as more promise than observation, and if we disregard this instruction of the fear of the Lord as the starting point, then we put in whatever our religious observance is, and God spits back out to us good things. There is truth in the scripture of you reap what you sow, but the plug and play, I put in my $1.25 of religious good stuff, and God then has to give me X, is pretty dangerous theologically. And so we have to be careful of that a little bit here. And we have to remember, and we have to be guided by the fact that what is going on in the text of Proverbs, these are instructions to a son. This father wants to see his son grow and be wise and be righteous and be holy and be as God intended. Loving Lady Wisdom, having friendship with wisdom, being actively engaged in what God provides to us in wisdom, something that from Proverbs' perspective, we can only get from God. God is the only wise God. He's the only God, but he's the only wise God. Wisdom itself originates within the character and nature of God. So here's what Proverbs is aiming at. Proverbs is attempting to answer some of the problems with the fall, with sin, with humanity's tendency to do things that it should not do. So, hear, my son, your father's instruction. Forsake not your mother's teaching. They are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. Verse 10. If sinners entice you, do not consent. It's Genesis chapter 3. If you are enticed, don't give in to it. Don't give in to it, because it will only end up in your harm. Verse 15, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. Verse 18, these men lie in wait for their own blood, and they set an ambush for their own lives. Such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain, takes away the life of its possessors. And now we get into wisdom personified. Wisdom cries aloud in the street, in the markets she raises her voice. And now we're going to get this contrast between wisdom and all of its grandeur and all of its goodness and folly or foolishness. And Proverbs, right off the bat, is aiming at, listen, do not fall into the enticements of sin. Do not be disobedient. Don't give in to going and finding those things that you think are going to make you happy outside of what God has said is good. We start right off the bat with understanding that God defines our goods for us. Don't go and do these things that will give you riches. Don't go and do these things that might profit you, albeit in a very bad way, but they might profit you because they will only lead to something bad in the end. It will take away the life of its possessor. This is what we've got. We can seek something outside of what God has said is good, outside of God's created partnership with us, outside of our dependence on God. We can seek to find something outside of what God has designed for us, to be in partnership with Him, to be dependent upon Him, to know from Him what is good and bad. Or we can decide for ourselves what is good and be swallowed alive by the grave. This is what Proverbs is aiming at. Humanity in Genesis chapter 3 has violated its created intentions. We have been disobedient to what God has designed humanity to be, in a dependent partnership with Him, ruling over the world and the created order. United, Adam and Eve as one flesh, united as a human entity, as a whole humanity, and united with God in what God has intended for us. And Proverbs says, listen, the tendency now, our temptation is to be enticed to do something outside of that original design, outside of what God has intended and planned for us, to be outside of God's good, because we determine that something else is good. Proverbs' answer to that is chapter 1, verse 7. Before you get to defining for yourself what is good and what is evil, Genesis chapter 3, she looked and she saw the tree was good for wisdom, for knowing good and evil, knowing good and bad. Before we get to that point of knowing good and bad for ourselves, Proverbs says, fear the Lord. Understand, you can define it for yourself, but you may just be setting yourself up for failure. It is the fear of the Lord and knowledge of the Holy One that leads us to say, I don't know, God knows best. And it gets us back to doing the right things based on The fear of the Lord before we have to be afraid of the Lord. And knowing God, knowing knowledge of the Holy One. Ultimately, by wisdom, Proverbs aims to repartner us, to make us redependent upon God. We're going to zoom down here to Proverbs chapter 3 and take a look at kind of what we're talking about. So, on the negative, it sounds negative anyway, but on the negative, fear the Lord. Before we have made choices that necessitate we are afraid of the Lord. Genesis chapter 3, and Adam and Eve hiding because they've been disobedient. On the positive, chapter 3, verse 1, my son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. This, chapter 3, verse 3, sounds like the Shema Israel out of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And when Moses gives those commands, he instructs Israel to bind them on their foreheads and on their hands as a remembrance of God's instructions, of God's activity, of God's work with them. It doesn't start with just knowing wise things. It starts with knowing God. Right? Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Steadfast love and faithfulness to what? To God, to what He asks, to His definition of the good. Bind them, tie them, wrap them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. That sounds a bit like the prophecy from Jeremiah where God will write the covenant, the new covenant on the heart. Wisdom in Proverbs is an answer to the human problem of what we did, what Adam and Eve did in Genesis chapter 3. So the result, you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. Don't we teach this to our children this way? It goes well for you if you do the right thing. And you do the right thing the right way. It goes good for you. It's good. Most of the time, yes. All of the time, no. Sometimes we can do the right thing and somehow it backfires. Somebody doesn't react the way we are promised they'll react. Verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. Proverbs 1, 7 and 9, 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I'm going to look at this trust word really quickly here. It's important to us. It's about refuge. And it's about confidence. The word, as a noun, is a place of refuge, a place of safety, a place of confidence and assurance of hope, of security. And so it means to place all of that, to put our confidence, our hope, our security, our safety, our cares, ourselves, trust in, to put all of that in. Put all of that in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. It is not our understandings that define what is good and bad. This early piece of what's going on in Proverbs shapes the instructions with the rest of the book. In all your ways, acknowledge Him. He will make your paths straight. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Is not this the problem of Genesis chapter 3? Is it not? Let's go back. Genesis chapter 3. Right? Genesis chapter 3. Where are we? Verse 6. So, when the woman saw the tree was good for food, and it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took its fruit and ate, and gave some to her husband who was with her, and he also ate. Do not be wise in your own eyes. We have two choices. We can be wise in our own eyes and decide for ourselves. I know what God has told me. He's told me not to eat from this tree. Eve even intensified the commandment in the garden. She said, no, he told us not to eat from it, not even touch it. But then when she looked at the tree and was enticed by the serpent and the fruit of the tree, and she understood that she could be wise without God's definitions. She could be wise in a way of her own making. She could be wise in her own eyes. Proverbs 3, verse 7. We ended up with a problem. The instruction in Proverbs is exactly the opposite. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord. And perhaps we can insert here, like our friends from the Bible Project would say, fear the Lord before you have to be afraid of the Lord and turn away from that evil thing, from that bad thing, whatever that thing is. It is better for us to fear the Lord before we have to be afraid of the Lord. Go down to verse 11, chapter 3. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof. The Lord reproves the one he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. And then the rest of this is the blessings, kind of like the Beatitudes of Proverbs here, from the gain of wisdom. And in verse 18, we get this really interesting one. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. The tree of knowing good and evil in the garden, the tree of knowing good and bad, became for Adam and Eve and for us the tree of death. To know good and bad, apart from God's design and intention, brought death. To seek after wisdom without the fear of the Lord, without the knowledge of the Holy One, without any of this involved in it, without God at its center, led us to a place where we suffer and die. Sin entered the world, and now suffering and death because of sin. On the flip side, to know the Holy One, to fear him, to live in that reverence and that awe and a little bit of that fear before we are sort of mandatory afraid of God. To have that wisdom is to find the tree of life, which was also in the garden. Wisdom is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called blessed. Verse 16, long life is in her right hand, and in her left are riches and honor. When Solomon asked God for wisdom, God comes to him in a dream, and he says, ask me for whatever you wish, and I'll give it to you. And Solomon says, I want wisdom, so I know good and bad according to your definitions, and I can rule this people, your people, the right way. And God says, since you didn't ask for long life or riches and honor, but you asked for wisdom to rule, I'll give you long life, riches, and honor. This is the paradigm of Proverbs. That when we do the good, as God has defined the good, then God provides to us the things we want. It sounds a bit like Jesus when he says, seek first the kingdom and its righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you, will be given to you. This is kind of the paradigm of Proverbs. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom, because if you find wisdom as God has defined it, then good things come to you. Goodness and mercy, in the words of the Psalms, will follow you all the days of your life. When we find wisdom, when we seek first God and his kingdom, when we have knowledge of the Holy One and the fear of the Lord, then all the rest of it is added to us. This is the perspective of Proverbs. And it's the observation of Proverbs that God doesn't turn away from the people who honor him with the way that they live. He doesn't leave them hanging. He doesn't abandon them. So the observations of Proverbs, the rule is that if we do wisdom the way God has asked us to do wisdom, then it goes well for us. But remember, what's in Proverbs are truisms, observations. These are good things that come to us because we do God's ways. And it's a response to what happened here in Genesis chapter 3, where the rule, but he shall rule over you, where the rule is now other than what was intended. Proverbs is, it seems, trying to reset the record, trying to reset the system and say, you know what? If we could get back to that wisdom we had before we ate from the tree, and we could find wisdom and gain understanding that starts with the fear of the Lord and the knowledge of the Holy One, it'll go well for us. And all of the rest of the practical instructions circle around that single concept. Proverbs, in a way, is an answer. It seems to be the wisdom literature answer to the problem of the fall and the human condition of sin. It gives us truisms and phrases and observations about life that are the rule. Although, as we encounter Job and some of the other wisdom literature books, sometimes those rules have some exceptions. Be wary in reading Proverbs as promises. It's not vending machine theology. It's not. $1.25 of religious obedience does not mean that Jesus has to spit out your Diet Coke. God's not a vending machine. Taking Proverbs too far, or as promises, gets us into that kind of space. We're going to pick up the next time we do one of these little videos with the text of Job. Okay? I hope being able to kind of see the text and the definitions and things off to the side here was helpful. I'm just kind of playing with some ways to do this. I hope you all have a wonderful week. May God bless you and keep you as you go. Thank you so much.